Hello and welcome to Recognizing Fake News, a guide to avoiding scams, rumors, and propaganda. My name is Tim. I'm a librarian here at the State College of Florida, and this is a toolbox for thinking about all of the information that comes at us from every direction, all day, every day. We live in confusing and stressful times. So, without telling you what to think about specific issues and situations, this is going to try to provide a model for thinking about how you respond to what you read and what you hear and what you watch. This first section here is basically just going to be some real quick tips. Uh, Not surprisingly, from somebody working at a college, first principle is that evidence matters. Is there citations, links, or footnotes for this information? Do the sources cited support the argument that's being made? You're looking for consistency here. You're looking for evidence. So the advice here is to think logistically, and what that means is think in terms of numbers, of people, of resources. If a major event with many witnesses is alleged to be a hoax, how many people would need to be quote unquote in on it? Is it too many people to be realistic? Respect credentials, but also check them. We're told to respect expertise, but what happens when two sides of a conflict bring their own experts? What then? Well, you want to ask yourself, how qualified is someone to speak about a topic? Not all higher education is the same. Similar sounding fields can be very different, like climatology and meteorology. Many professions, like medicine, are very large, and thus some individuals might have beliefs not widely shared by their peers or supported by available evidence. Don't forget about the most important parts of scientific studies, that the results can be reproduced and verified. Types of fake news. The types of fake news that we're going to discuss in this presentation are satire, rumors, propaganda, bad journalism, and scams. And I want to make a couple of things clear. First off, even though we're using the term fake news, it's being used very loosely, and mostly just because it's a convenient label that just about everybody recognizes now. But not all of this is intentionally deceitful. Some of these categories are the the products of human error. In the case of satire, it's actually just that you're not even supposed to believe that it's true. It's just that some people don't get the joke. Um, so this is also a very simplified scheme of uh, fake news, and you might yourself think that there should be more categories because maybe some of these things that we're going to talk about don't belong in the same categories. Um, you may also find, as I did, that there's so much overlap that it's hard to truly pin down where one category ends and another begins. I am mainly focused on intent in this presentation, but you may think of other ways to draw boundaries. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. This section is going to deal with satire, which is not generally intentionally misleading, but like our little baby friend there, sometimes people aren't always in on the joke. Just so that we're clear on what I mean by satire, I'm defining satire as a joke that is presented as something real. It's told with the expectation by the satirist that the joke will be so absurd that no one will take it seriously. And yet, some people do fall for it. It's safe to say that most people like a good joke. Like, we all like to have a good laugh now and then. But that doesn't mean that we can't take humor a little bit seriously. Comedy is often a form of social commentary. It allows us to point out things that might be uncomfortable or to talk about things that are very serious but with a little bit of emotional safety. But you don't want to take a comedian too seriously. Even shows that blend comedy and information, like The Daily Show or John Oliver, may oversimplify a complicated issue for laughs. How to get the joke. Satire is usually the easiest of our quote unquote fake news categories to figure out. There are several professional satirists like The Onion and Babylon Bee that you can Google and it'll take you right to their site. And you can kind of figure out pretty quickly that these are not true news sites. This is one of those times where you want to actually read the comments. I know that the comments are often a toxic cesspool or a dumpster fire, but oftentimes someone will explain the joke if too many people are taking it seriously. Remember when we said that sometimes you can take humor a little seriously? Well, on this slide, we're going to take humor a little seriously. In reading the comments and reactions to a piece of humor, you may encounter the perspectives of people who feel bullied by a joke. Sometimes people will say that a humorist is punching down. This implies that they are being hurtful towards people who are often the target of bullying. Criticism is an insight into someone else's experiences and concerns. Try to take this as an opportunity to learn rather than as an attack. Even if you personally feel judged, that you feel that someone is judging you for what you find funny, um, try to consider the possibility that this criticism is coming from somebody who just truly wants to be understood and wants to correct misunderstandings rather than lash out. Journalism is often referred to as the first draft of history. That's because it's an attempt to make sense of things in the moment that it's actually happening or while it's still relatively fresh. We don't always have the benefit of emotional distance or the time that we would want to gather all of the facts. Um, I'm going to approach this in an effort to highlight like what are the features of responsible journalism so that you can recognize it and allow journalists to convince you themselves that they are acting in good faith rather than dictating to you which news feeds and you should subscribe to. Um, if they're practicing good journalism, then they should be able to show you rather than tell you. So what you see here is an attempt to very narrowly define some types of stories that you'll see in the media. Uh, this is by no means the only way to conceive of this, and this is very, very, very simplified. So the first being breaking news, which is I'm going to define as bare bones reporting on current events, stays very close to the facts, but this is a human being attempting to put into words what is going on, so it cannot be totally divorced from any kind of interpretation whatsoever. Word choices matter. Was it a protest or was it a riot? Analysis. This is an attempt to provide background information for an audience that may not recognize connections to other events or is unfamiliar with what elements make this story significant. So there's more interpretation going on, but it's still trying to stay on the side of explaining rather than trying to provoke a specific emotional response or feeling. So editorial, this is the most emotional, most subjective. You have a commentator going further than analysis, putting more of their personal values and worldview into a topic in order to make an argument for a specific response that they want to see from the audience. Building trust. As much as we might want to and often say that we believe that the media should be completely and totally neutral, um, in all practicality, that's not strictly possible. Journalists are human beings. They are applying some of their own judgment to what they're observing, what they're trying to tell us. Um, Even if the purpose is exposition or explanation, there is still a little bit of an argument being made, even if that argument is that you should believe this version of events that I am telling you. So here are some quick reference points for what that looks like in practice. Like a good research paper, good journalism is clear about its sources. The news consumer should be able to reconstruct the events described using the provided evidence. Now, exceptions do apply. Sometimes witnesses and sources have their identities concealed for their own protection or privacy. And you are being asked in these situations to trust that the journalist is being reasonable in allowing them to have this protection, and that their reasons for requesting it are valid. Journalism, like many professions, has a code of ethics that can be researched, and media organizations will generally have editorial policies that describe how they determine what is newsworthy and how they decide what is fair and responsible reporting. These are all things that are fairly easy to look up if you do searches for them. There are many journalistic professional organizations that you can Google. They will outline their code of ethics. Any news website that's credible should have a section where you can find their editorial policies. Stories about current events develop very quickly. In the wake of a dramatic and complex situation, reporters are faced with hard choices. What does the public need to know, and what is trivia? When does the public need to know? How easily can the reporter verify what they've learned? There's an old joke in pretty much every service industry. You often see it in car repair shops. Cheap, fast, or good. Pick any two. The implication being that anything that is cheap and fast won't be good. Anything that's fast and good won't be cheap. You get the idea. If you've ever waited to write a research paper until it was almost due, then you have an idea of what it's like to try to do good, accurate work on a tight deadline. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't trust anything that you read or see, but be open to corrections and new discoveries. Contradictions in how we talk about a story now versus how it was originally understood when it was first unfolding are often held up as a sign of something nefarious happening. Well, there's a lot of good reasons why it can happen for entirely innocent or even good reasons. We're used to Google time, but discovering new information takes time. A person did hours, days, even years of work to make content that we just skim. Public records laws, such as the Freedom of Information Act, can result in the release of documents years after an event. The descendants of notable people are often more willing to tell their stories and share journals after that person is deceased. Changes in the availability of evidence and cultural attitudes change what we think is relevant or who is credible. So these are all things to take into consideration on why you should be open to updating your assumptions about how the world works or how a story was first reported. Context matters. A case study. In 1994, a woman was awarded $2.9 million after suing McDonald's after spilling hot coffee on herself. In 2022 terms, this story, quote unquote, went viral. It was talked about on TV, written about extensively, and so on and so forth. It was also widely mocked by some and used as an example of greed and a broken legal system. But there are some very important details missing here. When 50 words aren't enough. When the 81-year-old woman spilled coffee on herself, It was McDonald's policy to serve coffee between 180 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. That's almost boiling. The woman was hospitalized for a week with third-degree burns and required a skin graft. The most thorough story published on the day of the trial verdict was 697 words long. Some reports were as short as 48 words. This slide is 76 words long. Rumors, hoaxes, scams, and conspiracies. At the beginning of this presentation, I made a point of saying that the categories that I'm using are very loose and the boundaries between them are very messy. And this is a perfect example. I'm going to actually treat these as almost exactly the same as one another just because their boundaries are, like I said, very fluid. Have you ever had someone tell you a wild story that you weren't sure if you completely believed, and when you asked them where they heard it from or what's the proof, they say everyone knows it's true? Rumors will often assert that it has to be true because everyone is talking about it, or everyone knows it's true. Attempts to debunk the story are explained by that's just what they want you to think. Rumors, hoaxes, and conspiracies are often thin on details or sourcing and rely on the audience filling in the blanks with their own assumptions. If someone tells you a wild story about a person, a group of people, or an event that uh, lots of people witnessed and there's a commonly told story about it, pause and reflect. Like other forms of storytelling, rumors, hoaxes, and conspiracies often use familiar patterns. If you change just one or two elements, you have probably heard some version of the story before. These modern myths will often disappear from mainstream discussion for a time. Then they will reemerge after having been reinvented for a new situation or with new claims to try to explain away efforts to debunk the original story. Show your work. You've probably heard this from at least every single math teacher you've ever met. This is also true when you're trying to figure out what's real or not. If you investigate a far-fetched claim, often you will find researchers who have traced the history of a story across many different retellings. A good debunker will provide references and citations you can use to follow their thinking when they say that something is false. Conspiracy theorists will often attack the credibility of sources of information other than themselves or other conspiracy theorists. They want you to believe that they are the only ones you can trust, and all of the eyewitnesses, all of the people who have collected evidence, all of those people, which might be thousands upon thousands of people, are all lying to you. Watch what they say, then watch what they sell. Scams will often try to convince you that buying a product or donating will make the world a better place or you a better person. Before you send money, research details about the organization you're supporting, the products, and the cause. Follow the money. A reputable business or charity will be transparent about how their product or service works. Make sure that the help being offered makes practical sense and that the intended recipients, such as disaster victims, are actually receiving the aid. Okay, here we go. Propaganda. I saved this one for last because it has so many elements of the other categories of quote unquote fake news. And remember, we're using the term fake news very loosely here, and all of these labels for all of these categories are very loose. And you're going to see just how much in common they all have as we go forward. You're either with us or against us. This statement illustrates the zero-sum thinking of propaganda. Propaganda wants you to think that there is only one correct way to approach an issue or a situation, and that if you are on the wrong side, you're a bad person. Propaganda is intended to change how a person thinks and feels about an issue or a category of people. Advocacy also does this, but advocacy is usually intended to clear up misunderstandings or to advocate for people rather than against people. Propaganda is also more likely to use falsehoods or trickery. All of the advice up to this point, from satire to scams, applies to propaganda. At the risk of being repetitive, as I said, the categories that I'm using in this presentation are very fluid and they all share a lot of common traits. So here's some similarities between propaganda and other quote unquote fake news. Propaganda will often engage in sensationalist language and irony, like satire. Like rumors, propaganda is often thin on details, letting the audience fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. Like conspiracy theories, propagandists will often attack anything that contradicts their narrative as evidence of an effort to undermine the people and causes they claim to support. Propaganda in conflict. You'll often find, almost always find propaganda in wars or times of deep social conflict, uh, because this is when people are looking for support from potential allies. Um, in these kinds of situations, they will rely even more heavily on exaggeration, omission, and even outright falsehoods. Belligerents will showcase their greatest achievements, downplay or ignore their setbacks, deny any wrongdoing, and place a special emphasis on the worst excesses of their opponents. That doesn't necessarily mean that both sides are equally at fault, but they are highly motivated to show each other as being the worst that they could possibly be, and showing themselves as being the most morally righteous side. The truth matters, especially if we don't like someone. It's often tempting to simply assume that something that sounds like something a group or individual we find unpleasant would say is true. Our instincts will tell us they must be guilty of something. Recall advice from other sections of this presentation. Be open to new information. Being unfair damages our credibility and adds to climates of anger and distrust. Now, there is an exception here, which is that if you are in a situation where you feel physically unsafe or you're experiencing emotional abuse, then just get out of that situation. When in doubt, go to the source. The text of laws, bills, executive orders, ordinances, and other government documents are almost always accessible through official government websites. While some of the writing of government documents is often technical, reviewing the original text will allow you to ensure that sources debating it are using the correct wording. Did they really say that? This is something that you really ought to ask yourself more often. Remember, avoid reflexive sharing just because it sounds like something they would say. Most public officials maintain a website, a press office, and a social media presence. A visit to their page or official website can often help you verify if someone really said something and what the original context was. Not everyone is out to get you. Be on guard, but be open to the idea that disagreement can come from different worldviews instead of ill intent. Remember, we're all people and we're not perfect. Like we talked about in the section on journalism, there's only so many hours in the day to make sure that we get everything right. Fake news, propaganda, scams, sloppy journalism. It's not a fun topic to talk about. It's an interesting topic. but it can be very disturbing and disorienting. Don't expect perfection from yourself. Trying to be mindful about how you consume information when there is so much of it may seem overwhelming. Don't panic. In times of high stress, it is okay to slow down your news consumption to avoid burnout. You are better able to be on guard when you're rested and able to think clearly.